If you really want to be a successful person, look at the successful people who are out there. One of the things that strikes me is that their capacity for failing.
Mm-hmm.
They failed during their careers hugely. And here's where the Stoic part comes. But they also were resilient. They could bounce back.
Welcome to the Leadership Initiative, where we explore the art and science of leadership through thought-provoking conversations with experts, thought leaders, and change makers. Whether you're a seasoned leader or just starting out on your leadership journey, this podcast is designed to provide you with the tools and inspiration you need to lead with purpose and make a meaningful difference.
My name is Jen Shanahan, and I'm here today with William B. Irvine. Mr. Irvine is the author of 7 books, including A Guide to the Good Life and a Stoic Challenge. He taught at Cal State, Pacific Lutheran, and the University of Cincinnati. In 1983, he began his career at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, and he retired at the end of 2021. Now Professor Emeritus at Wright State, Irvine is graciously spending time with us to speak about Stoicism and leadership for the Fisher Leadership Initiative podcast. Okay, welcome, Bill Irvine. So good to have you here on the Fisher Leadership Initiative podcast.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Bill, we're having this conversation a day after the new United States president was elected, and it is a very emotional time for a lot of people. And I think it's an interesting time to be talking about leadership and to be talking about leadership and Stoicism specifically. And I want to dive in and just start off with a really general question. What aspects of Stoic philosophy are the most applicable to leadership?
Stoicism, a little bit of background here. It's a very, very old philosophy, actually, with huge psychological components. So you could almost say we classify it as a philosophy, but it's got this other component. Dates back to 300 BC, very long time ago. And so a lot has changed since then. So these early Stoics came up with ways to get through the world and its challenges without really being crushed by them or without being dispirited by them. And they came up with these really interesting psychological strategies you could use in the face of a variety of setbacks. And every day there are setbacks. Some are tiny little setbacks. You can't find your car keys. Some are really big, like learning the outcome of an election, and that will go different ways for different people. But the thing is, although a lot has changed since 300 BC, human psychology is not different. And that is because we were wired on the savannas of Africa millions of years ago, and that is very slow to change. So we're wired to survive and reproduce on the savannas of Africa, a million years ago. But we're in an environment that's nothing like that anymore. But because it hasn't changed, these strategies are still useful. Now, they affect a large area of things. So in my books, in particular, in the book Stoic Challenge, in sports, it comes into play in everyday life, and if you're a parent. But in leadership, too, there are going to be challenges that you're going to confront. And then the question is how to deal with those challenges. There's broader sorts of things that we can dip into, like if you're a brave leader, you're not going to take the easy way out, but you're going to try some things that might hopefully succeed, but have a risk carried to them. And then the question is, all right, so if it fails, what do you do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. What attracted you to this field in the first place?
Okay, I stumbled into it. So I first encountered the Stoics as I went to University of Michigan, just up the road from Ohio State, and had a double major in math and philosophy, and encountered the Stoics, strangely enough, in a logic class. None of my philosophy classes did it, but in a logic class, I stumbled across them, and it turns out they were the leading. You could say they invented what's called propositional logic. That's the logic of and or, if then, and it's what is at the base now of computer programming, because computer programming uses those kinds of connectives in order that's what happens when you write a program. It gets turned into that. So you could say that they invented the computer. That would be an incredible stretch, but you could say that, and sometimes I do. But that's where I encountered them. And then other than that, I heard, and they did other stuff as well, didn't bother to look into it until early 2000s. I wrote a book called On Desire, Why We Want What We Want. And at that time, what motivated me to write that is I was toying with the idea of becoming a Zen Buddhist. And then, since I was rising through the academic ranks, if you get a book published, you can go up the ladder. So I thought, while I'm doing this research on becoming a Zen Buddhist, I can actually turn it into a book. But for it to be a balanced book, I have to look at alternative philosophies of life. This notion of what is a good life and how do you live it. And I thought, and I should do a good job, cover a lot of them. One of them was Stoicism. And again, I knew them for their logic. But then I stumbled across these psychological strategies that they had developed and just was incredibly, why didn't they tell me this? I was a philosophy major, and that's because probably still true now, but back then, analytic philosophy this would have been in the 1970s. Analytic philosophy was the big thing. So if you went to your professor and said, well, what about strategies for living? They would have said, well, that's not what philosophers do, and then to find out, well, they used to do that, and they still could do that, and they probably should do that. And so I looked into them and was just blown away. Because I tried some of their psychological strategies in my own life, and they worked remarkably well. And I came out of the book no longer wanting to be a Zen Buddhist. If you're going to give Zen Buddhist a try, you might have your moment of enlightenment tomorrow, or it could be in 30 years, but Stoicism, my standing joke, and actually we're coming up on a 3-day weekend here, but my standing joke is that in a 3-day weekend, you can learn enough about Stoicism and try out its strategies for you to know whether it's going to work for you or whether it isn't going to work for you. So, I did that, and I thought, this is incredible. So my next book was a book called Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, in which I kind of told the history of Stoicism and rolled out these strategies. And then, much to my amazement, it turns out there was a market for this kind of thing. So the book did well for this is a academic press book, and it caught on with a broader audience, and then there was no going back, because then I had kind of established my credentials as a Stoic. It was a very lonely thing to be back then, but now there's a flood of Stoic books coming out. There are a number of different organizations. So maybe I'm a fire starter, right? So that would be a nice way to put it.
So it started with the topic of desire, and your book on desire. And I'm curious, what is something that you would recommend to help leaders to connect with this idea of desire and get a handle on their own desires, which are sometimes in conflict with what will, benefit the greater good?
Yeah, I would imagine that there's a very interesting component of conflict there because you have what's good for you in two different senses of the word. One of the things that's good for you is to sell a lot of product or
Mhm.
services, whichever you're in the business of doing. And there are a lot of different ways to achieve that. And one of them is to find these triggers for desire within people and then push those buttons and get those people to buy the goods and services that you're selling. You can make a case sometimes that you're doing them a favor. You're doing people a favor to manipulate them in that way because it's for their own good. They just don't realize it. And a really good ad or ad campaign is something where you're saying to people, hey, this new thing exists and it might change you. But of course, there's a second path, and that is to plant these little seeds of desire in people's minds. And when you find yourself wanting something, here's an interesting exercise you can do.
Mhm.
Figure out, why do I want that? Well, try to follow back in the chain and think, when did I first hear about that? Why do I suddenly want something that for all of my life, for decades,
Mhm.
never even occurred to me to want that, and now I do. And how did that happen? Now, of course, you look at all the advertising that gets done, and it's a very important thing. And then what is advertising? Well, it's informational. We're letting people know we're out there. Yeah. And what's the other thing? Well, we're trying to plant
Mhm.
these seeds of desire that will grow into full-fledged desires so they will buy goods and services that we're doing. So you've got an interesting ethical challenge, and that is okay. So I'm doing this, and I'm making a living off of doing this. And there are times when it's clear you've crossed the line. You're a drug addict, and you're trying to get the person to use drugs so you can make the money or whatever. But of course, in most cases, that certainly isn't true. There's a legitimate product that you're trying to sell. So you have to decide in your own mind, where is that line? And if you step across it, you might make a ton of money, but you might have this feeling. You might have thoughts that disturb you about the way you're living your life. And the whole idea of, well, if you ask Stoics, what should you be going for? Should it be a big paycheck? They would have said no. By the way, Seneca, one of the leading Roman Stoics, was a first century AD equivalent of a billionaire. He
Oh.
was also the leading playwright of his time and one of the most prolific Stoics of his time. So he was a billionaire. He was really rich for that time. And if you said to him, so what is money the most important thing? He would have said no. What's really important is equanimity. That is a state in your mind where you're free from negative desires. What are the negative desires? They're desires like greed, anger,
Mhm.
wishing you could have something that you don't have, negative desires. But the Stoics were not against emotion, they were against negative emotions. So they
Mhm.
were perfectly happy with emotions like joy, feelings of delight, a sense of awe. And so they said, if you really want to know what's important in life, it's not money, it's equanimity. It's that balanced state of mind where you don't feel driven. And one of the things I know, and see, I've been practicing Stoic for 2+ decades now, and still, in the middle of the night, you wake up and those voices start, those crazy voices that remind you of something somebody said 10 years ago, and you're still working through that. So I'm in another line on this particular investigation is we care very much about social status. We're wired to do that.
Mhm.
That's again our evolutionary past. So how do you gain social status? Well, one way is to be really, really rich and then to flaunt what you got. because you take this sort of strange delight in other people envying you. And now that social media has come along, we have this thing where people are going deep into debt to
Mhm.
try to get complete strangers to envy their way of living, which is madness. This is the one life you've got to live, and that's how you're going to spend it doing that. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so a lot of what they say is still very, very relevant to us today. And if somebody is in a leadership position, more generally, if somebody's trying to create and sell goods and services to the public, it's a relevant thing to think about.
We teach and think about leadership in terms of personal leadership and the competencies there, and then relational leadership, so leading teams and leading people, and then stewardship. And I think when it comes to the personal leadership, that seems to be something that's coming up a lot for a lot of people, as you just mentioned. And I'm curious from that purview, what do you recommend in terms of after having that awareness that that's what's happening, that it's an exercise or something that we can do to counter that?
Yeah, it's really important. We judge ourselves by metrics.
Mhm.
So the metric can be, well, what was your income last year versus your income this year? How many likes did you get on the internet? You got to be very careful about choosing your metrics, and you got to say, what does this really mean? It's a way of counting things, and that's what fixates us. It's a way of counting, keeping, analytical track of how we're doing. But is it the right metric? Because there are other metrics you can choose, or they're not even metrics. They're just qualitative kinds of sensations that you have. One other thing for somebody in a leadership position, and a lot of people say this, but the more I think about it, the more I realize it's important, is when you are evaluating the people who you're leading,
Mhm.
again, you get to choose a metric. You can, it's an option. And it's really easy to just use the end result as your how much money, how did your sales do? That's a nice metric. And it's a number, it's a concrete, and you can put it on a piece of paper and say, well, here's why you're not getting that raise because of this. Um, it's messier if you don't rely on a simple metric. It's messier if you go into it. But this whole notion of judging somebody on the process they're using rather than the product that comes out the end, right? So, are they doing it the right way? Think about an insurance company. This would be a classic example.
Mhm.
And an insurance company, if you said to somebody who's an underwriter, who's deciding risks, and if you came to him and you said, okay, you okayed this person and they died and we have to pay off. And what were you thinking? And of course, that's a stupid way to do it. And if you do it that way, then you're going to get it's bad feedback for the person because then the person's not going to be thinking what they should be thinking. What I need to do is I need to know there will be deaths. I need to make sure people are paying in more than they're paying out. And that's about process because process is something they can control. Okay. So yeah, those were some of the losers, but don't judge me on that. Judge me on broader things. Same thing with failure. Um, we live in fear of failure, partly because other people will point and say, maybe not to our face, but say he failed. He tried to do something and failed. So I'm now retired, but when I would teach my students, I would say, I've got a magic recipe for you so you can avoid failure. You need never fail again if you just do this. It's really simple. Don't ever do anything hard, and you will not fail. But if you really want to be a successful person, and this is uh, uh, look at the successful people who are out there. One of the things that strikes me is that their capacity for failing.
Mm-hmm.
They failed during their careers hugely. And here's where the Stoic part comes. But they also were resilient. They could bounce back. So to fail is not a disaster. Failing to bounce back, that's a disaster. Failing and not learning anything from the failure, that's really bad. I mean, so the goal should be you don't do crazy things, but you take risks. You do things that are difficult. Sometimes you do something that you know is difficult. Why are you doing it? Because it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It'll give you a chance at failing in a non-catastrophic way. Why? So you can practice bouncing back. So you can practice failing, learning from the failure. And then the way I like to put it is so you can go on and fail in better ways, right? And that's how you can reach a much higher goal. And again, be careful. Some failures are fatal. You know, you're out of the game then, and you don't want to do that. But taking risks. Stoics were okay with that. In fact, Stoics pushed this whole line, which is doing things that make you, where it's not failure, but just to make you uncomfortable. How come? Because then you get a chance to deal with that discomfort, and you'll become stronger. You'll come away more resilient.
Practicing stoicism for as long as you have, for 2 decades plus, how much easier is it now than it was when you first started some of these techniques in terms of finding that sense of equilibrium and that acceptance that's required to allow yourself to fail?
Um, the Stoics in the Stoic writings, these classic writings, they refer to the Stoic sage, and that's the person who has perfected his stoicism and never experiences negative emotions. And I've drawn the conclusion that that's an abstract entity, right? That's kind of like
Yeah.
the model at which we should aim. Because I know here's an interesting thing: when you get deep enough into it,
Mhm.
then one of the things that upsets you, you've got a whole new range of things to upset you, and that's when you let something stupid ruin your day. Because not only will the stupid thing have ruined your day, but then at the end of the day, when you assess that day, you'll say,
Mhm.
how stupid I was to let that stupid thing. But that's part of the process. That's part of the learning process. So I've gotten better about a number of things. I'm vastly more appreciative of my life than was once the case. Look around you, you can find people who just want to be pitied. They just want to say, look at how miserable I am. Don't you feel sorry for me? That's an easy trap to fall into.
Mhm.
And another way you can proceed is to look around you and realize that almost regardless of your circumstances, you are living a life that literally a billion people on the planet would swap with you in an instant.
Mhm.
Okay? So somebody in Sudan,
Mhm.
where do they have a floor? They have dirt floor. They have a tent. They're starving. Water is an issue. No air conditioning, and it gets hot there. And you go through the list of things, and
Mhm.
then you look at even impoverished Americans, much better standard of living, and yet those impoverished Americans might go around in that state of misery. They're
Mhm.
living somebody else's dream, though. And if you think of it in those terms, it really helps. So Stoics have this thing called negative visualization, and that's the way you do it. It's easy to do, and that is in the course of a day, you think about something that's going right in your life, and you give yourself a second or two to imagine that thing suddenly disappearing. So
Mhm.
it could be your job, it could be your house, it could be your partner. You go through the list of things and you just imagine. Suppose it's your partner. Suppose you get that phone call.
Mhm.
Are you so and so? Because your husband, wife, whatever, uh,
Mhm.
So what does that accomplish? You don't dwell on it because that's a recipe for depression. But the interesting thing, it's almost like magic because then the next time you encounter that person, you will feel this upsurge of, gosh, isn't it wonderful that this person is still part of my life? Because it doesn't have to be that way. We live in a tricky and dangerous world, and you can do that about almost anything. The power, right? Power we take utterly for granted. Water, drinkable water,
Yes.
take for granted. Our health, depending, take for granted. And it's all there in a kind of fragile way, could go away.
Mhm.
So you come away very appreciative, and I'm massively more appreciative of my life now. You get me started, and I'll go on for a half hour about all the neat things that didn't happen to me today that could have happened, but they didn't. And isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. It makes me think about the way that sometimes communities come together and neighbors who have never spoken to each other come out and form impenetrable relationships after a natural disaster or with a threat even of something like that. And yeah, we how much we take for granted. That's a incredible reminder.
Let
I
me
thought,
let me sneak in there. COVID.
yes.
People didn't have to imagine what it would be like to be without something. COVID told them because it took it away. Like simple pleasures like going to a restaurant and ordering dinner. Couldn't
Yeah.
do that anymore. And then suddenly people realized, wow, that has been something in my life all of those years of my life. And yet I took it utterly for granted.
Mhm.
So it was kind of an interesting wake up call for people. Thing is that as soon as, I told you that it only takes a few seconds to do that,
Mhm.
within an hour, it will have gone. You will have reverted to your old self and you'll be taking things for granted. But this negative visualization you can do as needed. You can
Mhm.
repeat the exercise and it'll have the same effect.
Do you have a way of reminding yourself to do these things, like a tattoo on your hand or something like that, so that when you look down, you see it? And I
I'm now an old man. I'm trying out the notion of becoming a curmudgeon, because
Mhm.
I'm at the appropriate age and everything else. So now I have a trigger signal, and that is when I feel myself getting peevish about something, to just stop and take a breath and say, I really got it pretty good. Even the thing I'm being peevish about.
Mhm.
Okay, the person who's responsible, who's triggering me, is a wonderful person. I'm so lucky that that person is there. There's another thing that Stoics do, and that is, Seneca referred to it as the bedtime meditation. That is, before you go to sleep, review your day,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
sometimes you're going to give yourself a pat on the back because, oh, here's somebody who provoked me. I didn't fall for the provocation. I instead used a stoic strategy of kind of bypassing the provocation. Pat on the back. In another case, ah, man, I let myself get upset over that. Ah, such a fool. But then you rededicate yourself and you say, I've still got stuff to work on. Not there yet. But with luck, tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll get another chance to get it right.
Yes, such important reminders. Bill, what are you working on now? What are you writing and creating?
So I write books. It's what I do. I can't help myself. But I write books. So there's one kind of off at Oxford University Press, and it's about thinking critically but keeping an open mind. And in that, I talk about the impact that social media and AI
Mhm.
have had. So it's about thinking more and better. So however good you think, you can think more than you do, and you can think better than you do. And so I give some information on that. It looks like next up on the runway after that, though. So I'm in this long period where I've submitted the manuscript for the book I just described, but then
Mhm.
there's a long slack period, and instead of just waiting around, I kind of started on a different project. And it's about religion and how people choose religions. There's so many choices, and yet many people find just the right one. And just asking a lot of childlike questions about religion.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. Thank you so much for your time and all your wisdom. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. I've had a splendid chat with you.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.